They said the war would end with a command, a signature, a flag lowered somewhere on a distant hill, but on a cold gray morning in Germany, it almost ended with a single man refusing to surrender. The town sat in silence under a heavy sky, the kind of silence that makes soldiers check their watches and look again at the horizon. Broken shutters tapped softly in the wind. Empty streets stretched between stone houses that had seen generations of quiet mornings before the war ever arrived. 3 miles away, American artillery crews waited beside their guns, every calculation finished, every shell prepared, every man watching the same direction. One order from Colonel James Carter, and the town would disappear from the map in less than 5 minutes. Carter stood beside a folding field table where a large map was held down by a pair of binoculars and a dented coffee mug. The map showed the town as a simple grid of narrow streets and old buildings. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth a second look on most days. But this morning the entire advance had stopped because of one message. The courier had arrived 20 minutes earlier, riding slowly down the dirt road with his hands raised and a white cloth tied to a stick. The American sentries had searched him, taken the message, and walked it straight to Carter. It was written in careful English, only one sentence long. Major Heinrich Foch refuses to surrender. No threats, no explanation, just the refusal. Around Carter, the officers expected the next step to be obvious. War had its procedures, and everyone knew them. You ask once. You wait. If the answer is no, the guns speak. The artillery crews already had the range set at 3 miles. A lieutenant stood nearby with a small notebook, ready to record the exact minute the order was given. Even the radio operator had his headset on, thumb resting near the switch that would send the signal down the line. But Colonel James Carter did not give the order. He read the sentence again, slowly, as if the words might change the second time. Major Heinrich Foch refuses to surrender. The name meant nothing to most of the men standing there. Just another officer in a war filled with officers. But Carter stared at the map as if the town itself were trying to tell him something. A breeze lifted the edge of the paper. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang once, the sound drifting faintly across the fields. The soldiers waited. Minutes passed. The guns remained silent. Finally, Carter folded the message, placed it beside the coffee mug, and looked toward the quiet town sitting 3 miles away. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No vehicles moved in the streets. Just silence. And one German major who had chosen to say no. Then Carter reached for his jacket, straightened it once, and did something none of the men around him expected. Instead of giving the order to fire, he began walking toward the town. The officers behind him thought at first that Colonel Carter was only stepping away from the table to think, but after 10 yards it became clear that he was not stopping. He moved down the dirt road at a calm, steady pace, the kind of walk a man takes when he has already made up his mind. A young lieutenant hurried after him for a few steps. "Sir, the town is 3 miles away," he said, unsure if the colonel had fully considered the distance. Carter nodded once without slowing. "I know exactly how far it is," he replied. The lieutenant looked back toward the artillery line where the crews still waited beside their guns, hands resting on cold metal, eyes following the strange scene unfolding across the open field. None of them had trained for this moment. They had trained for coordinates, calculations, and commands delivered over the radio. They had not trained for their commanding officer walking alone toward the very place they had prepared to fire upon. Carter continued down the road as the wind carried the faint smell of damp earth and old stone. The countryside around the town was quiet now, almost too quiet, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Every few hundred yards, he could see another sign that the war had passed through recently. A broken fence, a farm wagon left in the grass, a gate swinging slowly back and forth with no one there to close it. But the town itself remained still. From a distance, it looked like a painting left unfinished. Rows of gray buildings. A narrow church tower rising above the rooftops. No movement in the windows. No voices in the streets. Behind him, the American. Lines were already becoming smaller shapes against the horizon. A radio operator watched through binoculars and spoke quietly into his headset, describing what he saw. "The colonel is still walking," he said. "He is halfway there now." The artillery crews listened without speaking. A few of them glanced at the shells resting in their racks. Each one had been measured and loaded with careful precision. Each one represented a decision that had not yet been made. Inside the town, another man was also watching the road. Major Heinrich Foch stood near the entrance to the main street with a pair of field glasses held firmly in both hands. He had seen the movement long before the American soldiers realized what their commander was doing. At first he thought it might be a messenger or a scout, but as the figure drew closer the truth became impossible to ignore. One man, walking alone. Foch lowered the binoculars slowly. Around him a few German soldiers waited near the stone wall that marked the edge of the town square. They were tired men who had seen the long months of the war and understood how quickly things could change. One of them asked quietly if they should prepare a response. Foch did not answer right away. Instead, he looked again at the road stretching across the open field, where Colonel Carter continued his steady approach. No white flag, no escort, just a man crossing 3 miles of silence because someone had refused to surrender. Major Heinrich Foch continued to watch the lone figure approaching across the field until the details became clear enough that there could be no mistake. The man walking toward the town wore the uniform of an American colonel. No rifle, no escort, no flag tied to a stick. Just a steady pace that did not slow and did not hesitate. Foch lowered the binoculars again and slipped them into the leather case hanging at his side. For a moment he said nothing. The soldiers near him shifted their weight and glanced toward the empty road that led straight into the center of town. One of them finally spoke in a careful voice. He asked if the Americans were sending a messenger to demand surrender again. Foch shook his head slowly. "That is not a messenger," he said. "That is their commander." The soldiers exchanged quiet looks. Even men who had seen years of war understood that something about this moment was unusual. Commanders did not cross open ground alone when artillery stood ready behind them. Foch stepped forward a few paces until he stood at the edge of the street where the cobblestones began. The morning air carried a cool wind through the narrow lanes of the town. A loose shutter tapped softly against a wall somewhere above them. The place looked empty, but Foch knew better. Beneath the buildings and behind the thick stone walls, people were waiting. Families who had not left when the front line moved closer. Shopkeepers, farmers, old men who had lived their entire lives in the same houses. They had gathered in cellars and storage rooms since dawn, listening for the distant sound that would mean the town had been noticed by the guns outside. Foch had read the American message earlier that morning. 1 hour to surrender. It was a standard demand, written clearly and without emotion. Most commanders would have accepted it. But Foch had looked around the quiet streets and made a different choice. He knew exactly what would happen if the artillery opened fire from 3 miles away. Buildings would fall, roads would vanish under stone and dust, and the people hiding below would have no chance to reach the open fields in time. So he had written a reply with the same careful handwriting. Major Heinrich Foch refuses to surrender. No explanation, just the decision. Now the consequence of that decision was walking toward him across the open land. Foch could see the colonel clearly now. The man moved with the calm posture of someone who understood that every eye on both sides was watching. The distance between them grew smaller with every step. 2 miles had become 1 mile. 1 mile was becoming half a mile. Behind Foch the soldiers remained quiet. None of them reached for their weapons. None of them spoke again. The only sound was the wind moving through the empty street and the faint echo of boots on the road outside town. Foch straightened his coat, brushed a small trace of dust from the sleeve, and stepped forward until he stood alone at the entrance to the square. If the American commander had chosen to walk 3 miles to speak with him, then he would meet him there, not as a symbol of surrender, but as a man who had made a decision and intended to stand by it. Colonel James Carter felt the quiet of the countryside change as he crossed the final stretch of open ground. The town was no longer a distant shape on the horizon. Now he could see the details that only appeared when a place was close enough to breathe the same air. Stone houses lined the first street like silent witnesses. Their windows were dark, their doors closed. A wooden sign above a small shop creaked softly as it moved in the wind. Carter slowed slightly, not out of hesitation but out of awareness. When a man walks alone toward a town that has refused to surrender, every step carries weight. Behind him the road stretched back across 3 miles of empty land where American artillery crews still waited beside their guns. They could no longer hear the wind in the town. They could no longer see the movement of shutters or the narrow alleys between buildings. All they could see through binoculars was the small figure of their colonel approaching the entrance. Carter stopped when he reached the first row of houses. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and wood smoke that had long since faded. He listened for voices, for footsteps, for anything that might reveal who was watching from behind the walls. At first there was nothing, only the soft sound of wind passing through the street. Then he noticed a figure standing ahead near the center of the square. The man wore the gray coat of a German officer. His posture was straight, his hands calm at his sides. He had chosen to wait in the open where there would be no confusion about who he was. Carter began walking again, this time along the cobblestone street that led directly toward the square. Each step echoed quietly between the buildings. The distance between the two officers closed slowly. 30 yards, 20 yards, 10. When Carter finally stopped, the two men stood facing one another in the empty square, as if the entire war had narrowed to that single moment. Major Heinrich Fox studied the American colonel for a second before speaking. His voice was steady, neither hostile nor welcoming. It was simply the voice of a man who had expected this meeting from the moment he wrote his reply. "You walked 3 miles, Fox said in clear English. Carter nodded once. "Your message suggested it might be necessary." Fox allowed the faintest hint of a thoughtful expression. Around them the town remained quiet. Behind the shuttered windows and beneath the thick floors of the old buildings, unseen eyes listened carefully to the conversation beginning in the square. Carter looked briefly down the empty street before returning his attention to the German officer. "Most commanders would have answered that message with artillery," he said. Fox gave a small nod as if acknowledging a fact that both men understood well. "Yes," he replied. "That is what most commanders would have done." Carter studied him for another moment, then asked the question that had brought him across 3 miles of open ground. "So tell me, Major," he said calmly, "why did you refuse?" Major Heinrich Foch did not answer immediately. He looked past Colonel Carter for a moment, down the quiet street that led toward the edge of town, as if measuring the distance in his mind. The wind moved lightly through the square, brushing dust across the old cobblestones. Somewhere behind a shutter a faint movement could be heard, the soft sound of someone shifting carefully so that the floor would not creak. Foch finally returned his attention to the American officer standing in front of him. "Because surrender was not the real question this morning," he said calmly. Carter watched him without interrupting. Foch spoke with the steady tone of a man who had already spent hours thinking about every word. "If I had sent back a message agreeing to surrender, your artillery would have remained silent. That much is obvious." Carter nodded once. The logic was simple, but Foch continued before Carter could respond. "However, surrender is not something that happens instantly," the German major said. "Soldiers must gather. Orders must be given. Positions must be abandoned. And people must move." Carter studied him carefully now. "People," he repeated. Foch gestured quietly toward the buildings surrounding the square. The houses looked empty from the outside, their windows dark and their doors closed. But the major knew what was hidden behind those walls. "This town still has residents," Foch said. "They did not leave when the front moved closer. Some could not travel. Some simply refused to abandon their homes. When the artillery began preparing outside the town this morning, they came down into their basements." Carter glanced briefly at the nearest building. The stone walls were thick and old, built long before the war. They could shelter people from rain and cold, but not from the collapse of the town above them. Foch continued in the same calm voice. "If I had accepted your demand immediately, my soldiers would have had to move through the streets to gather and organize. The civilians hiding below would have heard the confusion and rushed outside, afraid they were too late to escape." Carter understood the picture now without needing further explanation. Panic in narrow streets. Families trying to reach open fields while soldiers tried to follow orders. Foch looked down for a moment, then back up. "The artillery was already prepared. I could see your positions from the church tower before sunrise." Carter did not seem surprised. Foch allowed himself a small breath before finishing his explanation. "So I refused. Not because I wished to continue fighting, but because refusal would make you stop and ask why." The square fell silent again. Colonel Carter looked slowly around the empty town, seeing it differently now. The quiet was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of people waiting below the floors and behind the walls, listening to every word spoken in the square. Finally Carter spoke again, his voice thoughtful rather than accusing. "You refused in order to buy time." Falk nodded once. Time for them to remain where they are until someone asks the question you just asked. Carter stood there for a long moment, the weight of the decision resting between two men in an otherwise silent town. Colonel James Carter remained still for several seconds after Major Heinrich Falk finished speaking. The quiet of the square seemed heavier now, as if the buildings themselves were listening. Carter slowly turned his head and looked at the windows around them. From the outside they appeared empty, but he had spent enough years in uniform to understand what silence like this usually meant. People were nearby, waiting, listening, hoping that the next decision made in this square would allow them to walk out of their homes again. Carter shifted his weight slightly and glanced toward the narrow street that led back toward the open countryside. 3 miles away his artillery crews were still waiting beside their guns, watching through binoculars and radios for any sign of what would happen next. The shells were ready. The calculations were finished. One message over the radio would turn this quiet town into a place of thunder and dust. But Carter did not reach for the radio clipped to his belt. Instead, he looked back at Falk. "How many civilians are we talking about?" Carter asked calmly. Falk answered without hesitation. "Approximately 200, he said. Families, shopkeepers, and several elderly residents who could not travel when the front line moved." Carter nodded slowly as he absorbed the number. 200 lives hidden beneath wooden floors and stone cellars while two armies decided what would happen above them. Falk continued speaking with the same measured tone. "They have remained underground since before sunrise. They heard the trucks and the artillery being positioned outside the town. They know what that usually means." Carter understood the unspoken part of the sentence. When artillery prepared to fire on a town, people rarely waited to ask questions. Falk took a small step toward the center of the square and gestured quietly toward the buildings around them. "If I had accepted surrender immediately, the streets would have filled with movement. My soldiers gathering, civilians emerging, confusion everywhere. And your artillery crews might have seen that movement and believed the town was preparing resistance." Carter looked again at the still windows and the silent doorways. Now the quiet felt different. It was not emptiness. It was patience. People waiting below ground because one officer had told them to remain there until he returned with an answer. Carter placed his hands behind his back and studied Falk carefully. "You gambled that someone on our side would be curious enough to ask why you refused," Carter said. Falk gave a small nod. "I believed the commander might prefer to understand the situation before making a decision that could not be reversed." The wind moved through the square again, stirring a loose sheet of paper that rolled gently along the cobblestones before coming to rest near the church steps. Carter followed it with his eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at the German officer. The war had taught both men that decisions were often made quickly and rarely questioned afterward. But this town had forced a pause, and sometimes a pause was enough to change the direction of everything that followed. Carter took a slow breath, glancing once more at the silent houses where 200 people waited for whatever answer these two officers would reach in the center of the square. Colonel James Carter walked slowly across the square, while Major Heinrich Falk remained where he stood, giving the American officer the quiet space to think. The cobblestones carried the soft echo of Carter's boots as he moved past the church steps and looked down the narrow side street that curved between two rows of houses. The buildings were old, their walls thick and weathered by decades of winters and rain. From the outside, nothing moved, yet Carter could feel the presence of people below the ground, waiting in silence for whatever decision would be made above them. He stopped beside a wooden door that led into one of the houses and rested his hand lightly against the surface. The wood was cool and still. No voices came from the other side, but the stillness felt deliberate, as if those inside were holding their breath. Carter stepped back into the square and looked again at Falk. "You ordered them to stay hidden," he said. Falk nodded once. "If they remain where they are, there is no confusion, no panic in the streets." Carter studied the German officer carefully. The man's posture had not changed since their conversation began. There was no sign of nervousness in his voice, no attempt to dramatize the situation. Only a calm explanation from a man who had made a difficult decision before the sun had even risen that morning. Carter glanced toward the road leading out of town, imagining the view from the American artillery positions 3 miles away. Through binoculars, the town would look almost empty. No movement in the streets. No soldiers running between buildings. Just quiet stone walls beneath a gray sky. From that distance, it would be easy to believe the town had already been abandoned. Carter folded his arms loosely and looked back toward Falk. "If I return to my lines without an answer," Carter said, "my officers will expect the artillery to fire." Falk did not argue with the statement. "That is what I assumed," he replied, "which is why I hoped you would come yourself rather than send another message." Carter gave the faintest hint of a thoughtful smile. "You seem very confident that I would choose conversation over artillery." Falk considered that for a moment before answering. "Not confident," he said quietly. "Only hopeful." The wind moved across the square again, carrying with it the distant sound of a loose sign tapping against a wall somewhere down the street. Carter looked around one more time, noticing how ordinary the town appeared despite the quiet tension resting inside it. A bicycle leaned against a fence. A flower box sat beneath one of the windows, the soil dry, but still holding a few stubborn green leaves. Small details of normal life that had been paused rather than erased. Carter finally returned to the center of the square and faced Falk again. "If those civilians stay underground," Carter said slowly, "how long can they remain there?" Falk answered without looking away. "Long enough for us to decide whether this town becomes another name on a map or simply a place where people go back upstairs." The words hung in the quiet air between them, simple and direct, waiting for the American colonel to decide which future would follow. Colonel James Carter stood quietly in the center of the square while the weight of Major Heinrich Falk's words settled into the still morning air. For a moment neither man spoke. The town around them remained frozen in the same careful silence, as if every wall and doorway understood that the future of the place depended on the next sentence spoken between two officers standing on worn cobblestones. Carter slowly turned his head toward the church tower rising above the rooftops. From that height, Falk must have seen the American artillery forming its lines at dawn. 3 miles was not far from modern guns. Carter knew the calculations his crews had made before sunrise. Elevation measured. Distance confirmed. Wind direction recorded. Everything prepared with the quiet precision that soldiers learn after months of long campaigns. From that distance, the town was nothing more than a grid on a map and a set of coordinates written beside it. Yet standing here now, the place no longer felt like a point on paper. It felt like a living place paused in the middle of an ordinary day that had suddenly become something else. Carter looked again at the rows of houses. Somewhere beneath those floors, 200 people waited in the dark, listening for a sound that would tell them whether they would climb the stairs again or remain hidden while history moved above them. The colonel slowly removed the radio from his belt and held it in his hand for a moment. Falk watched the small device carefully, but did not move. The radio represented the simplest path forward. One message sent through the quiet air, and the situation would resolve itself quickly. Armies preferred clarity. Decisions that required no explanation. Carter turned the radio over in his hand, feeling the cool metal against his fingers. Then he clipped it back onto his belt without pressing the switch. Falk noticed the motion and allowed himself the smallest breath of relief, though his expression remained composed. Carter finally spoke again, his voice thoughtful rather than sharp. 200 civilians, he said slowly, as if measuring the number once more. Falk nodded. Approximately. Carter began walking a slow circle across the square, studying the town from different angles. The front of a bakery stood across the street with faded lettering still visible above the door. A wooden cart rested beside a stone well near the church steps. Small details of ordinary life remained exactly where they had been left when the residents hurried below ground earlier that morning. Carter stopped beside the well and rested one hand on the cold stone edge. "You understand something, Major," he said without turning around. "My orders are to move forward. Every hour we delay gives other units time to reposition." Falk answered calmly. "I understand." Carter looked back at him now. "So whatever decision I make here must solve 2 problems at once." Falk held his gaze. "And what are those problems, Colonel?" Carter paused for a second before answering. "Continuing the advance," he said quietly, "without turning this town into something that no longer needs saving." The square fell silent again as both men understood what that balance would require. Colonel James Carter remained beside the stone well for a long moment after speaking. The quiet town seemed to lean inward around the square, as if every empty window were listening to the conversation unfolding below. 3 miles away, his artillery crews were still watching through binoculars, waiting for a signal that would turn uncertainty into action. But here in the square, time felt slower. Decisions were no longer measured in coordinates and calculations. They were measured in consequences that could not be undone once they began. Carter slowly stepped away from the well and walked toward the edge of the square where the narrow road led out between two rows of houses. He stopped there and looked down the street. The town was still silent, but now he could sense something beneath the stillness. Not fear exactly, something closer to patience. 200 people remaining below ground because one officer had asked them to trust him for a little longer. Carter turned back toward Major Heinrich Foch. "If I allow time for the civilians to leave their shelters," Carter said carefully, "my advance cannot stop here all day." Foch listened without interrupting. Carter continued, "My division must move forward by this afternoon. That means this town cannot remain under German control." Foch gave a small nod. "I expected that." Carter stepped closer now, the distance between the two officers shrinking until they stood only a few feet apart in the quiet square. "Then we are looking for a solution that lets both things happen," Carter said. "The civilians remain safe and the town changes hands without confusion." Foch considered the words for a moment before answering. "There may be a way," he said slowly. Carter raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting for the explanation. Foch gestured toward the street that curved past the church and continued toward the fields on the far side of town. "There is an open road that leads west for nearly 2 miles before reaching the farms. If the civilians leave in small groups, they can reach those fields without crossing the center of the town." Carter followed the direction of Foch's hand, imagining the route through the quiet streets and out toward the countryside. Foch continued, speaking with the same calm voice. "My soldiers can remain in their positions until the civilians have moved beyond the last houses. After that, they will gather here in the square and surrender formally." Carter studied him carefully. The proposal was simple, but it required something unusual in the middle of a war. It required both sides to trust that the other would honor a promise made in an empty square. Carter glanced again at the silent houses where 200 unseen listeners waited for the next words spoken above them. Then he looked back at Foch. "How long would it take," Carter asked, "for them to leave safely?" Foch answered without hesitation. "Less than 1 hour if they move calmly." The number hung in the air between them. 1 hour. The same amount of time the original surrender demand had given the town earlier that morning. Carter let out a slow breath and looked toward the road that led back to his waiting artillery crews, knowing that whatever decision he made now would travel across those 3 miles and shape what happened next. Colonel James Carter stood quietly for a moment after hearing Major Heinrich Foch's proposal, the idea settling slowly in his mind like a map unfolding piece by piece. 1 hour. The same amount of time that had been offered earlier for surrender. The same 60 minutes that could now determine whether the town would remain standing when the day ended. Carter looked down the street Foch had indicated, imagining the civilians emerging carefully from cellars and storage rooms, stepping into the pale morning light after hours spent listening to the silence above them. The road leading west curved gently between the houses before reaching open farmland beyond the town. From there the land spread wide and empty for miles. If the civilians moved calmly, Foch was right. They could reach the fields long before any army needed to move through the streets. Carter turned his attention back to the German officer. Foch remained steady, his expression calm but watchful, as if he understood that the next words spoken in the square would decide everything that followed. Carter placed his hands behind his back again and walked slowly across the cobblestones, measuring the distance from one side of the square to the other as though the ground itself might help him think. War had taught him that every solution carried risk. Every pause created the possibility that something unexpected might appear. But it had also taught him that sometimes the difference between destruction and survival was nothing more than a single decision made at the right moment. Carter stopped near the center of the square and faced Foch again. "If we do this," he said carefully, "your soldiers remain where they are until the civilians are beyond the last houses." Foch nodded once. "They will not move into the streets." Carter continued. "After that, they gather here in the square and surrender without delay." "Yes," Foch replied. Carter studied him for a second longer. "And during that hour," he added, "no signals are sent, no movements that could be mistaken for resistance." Foch answered with the same steady tone he had used since the conversation began. You have my word. The two men stood there in silence for a moment, the wind brushing lightly across the open square. Carter then reached down and unclipped the radio from his belt again. This time he held it firmly in his hand. 3 miles away, his artillery crews were still waiting beside their guns, watching through binoculars for any sign of what their commander would decide. Carter lifted the radio and pressed the switch. His voice was calm and clear when he spoke. This is Colonel Carter. Hold all artillery positions. Repeat, hold all artillery positions. No firing orders will be given. The reply came back after a brief moment of static, the operator confirming the instruction with a tone that carried both surprise and discipline. Carter lowered the radio and clipped it back onto his belt. Then he looked at Falk once more. You have 1 hour, Carter said quietly. Use it well. Falk gave a slow nod, understanding exactly what had just happened in the space of a few sentences. Somewhere beneath the floors of the silent houses, 200 people were about to receive the chance to walk back into daylight. Major Heinrich Falk did not waste a single second after Colonel Carter gave the order. He turned toward the nearest building and walked quickly but calmly to the wooden door Carter had touched earlier. He knocked 3 times in a steady rhythm, not loudly, but with the confidence of someone who knew people were listening on the other side. For a moment nothing happened. Then the door opened just a few inches, and a pair of cautious eyes appeared in the narrow space. Falk leaned slightly forward and spoke in a calm voice that carried across the quiet street. He told them the artillery had been ordered to hold, and that the civilians were to leave the town slowly and quietly through the western road. The door opened wider. Inside the dim hallway, several people stood close together, their faces pale from hours spent in underground rooms where daylight had not reached them. Falk repeated the instructions carefully, making sure every word was understood. No running. No shouting. Families should stay together and move in small groups. The road beyond the last houses would lead them to open farmland where they could wait safely. Within minutes, the first civilians stepped into the street. An elderly man emerged slowly with the help of a younger woman holding his arm. Behind them, a mother guided 2 children who blinked at the sudden brightness of the morning sky. Colonel Carter watched from the center of the square as the quiet town began to breathe again. Doors opened one by one along the narrow streets. People moved carefully into the daylight, looking around as if they expected the silence to break at any moment. But no artillery thunder came from the distant hills. The only sounds were footsteps and soft voices speaking in relief and disbelief. Carter noticed how Falk moved through the street with calm authority, guiding the civilians toward the road that curved west out of town. The German soldiers who had been stationed near the edge of the square remained exactly where they were, standing quietly and allowing the civilians to pass without interruption. It was an unusual scene in the middle of a war. 2 opposing officers standing only a few yards apart while families walked past them toward safety. A farmer pushed a small wooden cart carrying sacks of flour. A young boy held a folded blanket almost as large as himself. An elderly woman paused briefly near the well in the square and looked up at the church tower before continuing toward the road. Carter checked his watch. Only 15 minutes had passed since the radio call to hold the artillery. Yet the streets were already filling with quiet movement as more doors opened and more families stepped into the light. Falk returned to the square after directing another group toward the western road. He stopped beside Carter without speaking for a moment, watching the slow line of civilians moving away from the town. The 2 men stood there together in the cool morning air while the hour they had been given began to unfold exactly as they had planned. The line of civilians continued moving slowly through the town streets as the quiet hour unfolded exactly as Colonel Carter and Major Falk had agreed. Families walked together in small groups, some carrying small bags, others holding blankets or simple bundles of belongings gathered in haste before they had gone into the cellars earlier that morning. The sound of footsteps replaced the long silence that had filled the town for hours. Doors that had remained closed since before sunrise now stood open, revealing dim hallways and staircases that led down to the underground rooms where people had waited in the dark. Colonel Carter remained near the well in the center of the square, watching the steady movement toward the western road. Every few minutes, he checked his watch, measuring the passing time with the quiet discipline of a man responsible for more than one decision that morning. 30 minutes had already passed since the artillery order to hold. Major Falk moved through the streets with calm efficiency, guiding the last groups of residents toward the same road that curved gently out of town and disappeared beyond the final row of houses. The German soldiers remained in their positions exactly as promised. They stood quietly near the edges of the square or along the nearby streets, allowing the civilians to pass without interruption. The scene was strange even to those who were living it. A war that had stretched across continents had paused for one quiet hour inside a small town square. Carter noticed a group of children walking beside an elderly couple, the younger ones glancing back toward the houses as if trying to understand why the streets felt so different from the day before. A farmer guided a horse pulling a small cart loaded with tools and sacks of grain. Two sisters walked arm in arm, speaking softly as they followed the others toward the open fields beyond town. The line of civilians grew longer along the road leading west, stretching toward the farms where the land opened into wide, empty acres. Carter finally looked toward Falk as the last families stepped away from the square. The major gave a small nod, confirming what both men could already see. The streets were becoming quiet again, but this time the silence meant something different. The town was no longer holding its breath. It was simply empty. Carter checked his watch once more. 55 minutes had passed. The hour was nearly complete. Falk turned and raised one hand toward the German soldiers who had been waiting patiently along the street corners. They understood the signal immediately. One by one, they began walking toward the center of the square, their steps calm and deliberate as they gathered where Falk had promised they would. The final part of the agreement was about to begin. Major Falk stepped into the center of the quiet square as the last German soldiers approached from the surrounding streets, their boots moving across the stone road with a calm and measured rhythm that echoed softly between the empty buildings. Colonel Carter watched the gathering from beside the old well, his posture steady, his eyes following every movement with the same careful attention he had carried since the beginning of the morning. The square that had been filled with anxious silence hours earlier now held only a small group of uniformed men and the long shadows of the late afternoon sun stretching across the ground. Falk stopped a few feet in front of Carter and removed his gloves slowly, folding them once before placing them into the pocket of his coat. Around them, the remaining soldiers formed a quiet line. None of them spoke. They understood that the moment had already been decided by the choices made earlier that day. Falk looked around the square one final time, as if memorizing the town exactly as it appeared in that peaceful pause between two chapters of history. The open doors, the empty windows, the still air that carried no sound except the distant wind moving through the trees beyond the rooftops. When he turned back toward Carter, his expression carried a calm acceptance rather than defeat. Without ceremony, Falk reached to his belt and removed his sidearm. He held it carefully by the grip and extended it forward. Carter stepped closer and accepted the weapon with a respectful nod, not as a gesture of victory, but as recognition that the difficult decision had been honored by both sides. Behind Falk, the other German soldiers followed his example, placing their equipment down in an orderly manner near the edge of the square. The process unfolded quietly, almost methodically, as if everyone present understood that dignity mattered in moments like this. Carter signaled to Sergeant Daniel Hayes, who approached with a small group of American soldiers. Their instructions were simple and clear. Ensure that everyone was accounted for and prepare for a peaceful escort away from the town. Hayes acknowledged the order with a firm nod and began organizing the process with calm efficiency. Falk remained standing beside Carter for a moment longer, both men watching the final preparations take shape. In the distance, the western road could still be seen stretching across the open farmland, the long line of civilians now far beyond the town and safely away from the uncertainty that had hung over the morning. Carter finally glanced at his watch once more. The hour they had spoken about earlier had passed completely. Not a single artillery round had been fired. The town remained untouched, its buildings standing exactly as they had the day before, its streets quiet but intact. Falk noticed the gesture and allowed himself a faint, thoughtful smile. For a brief moment, the war had paused long enough for two officers to choose restraint instead of destruction. Carter closed the cover of his watch and looked across the empty square, knowing that the decision made in that small place would never appear on any large map or official report. Yet the people who returned to their homes later that evening would remember that the silence of that hour had protected everything around them.